All right, so get ready because today we are going to dive deep into a presidency, one that's often overlooked.
Definitely overlooked.
Yeah, Franklin Pierce.
Franklin Pierce.
Now, I'll admit,
Yeah.
before we started researching for this episode, I really didn't know too much about him.
You and most people, yeah.
Not the most.
The guy's kind of a mystery.
He is a mystery wrapped in an enigma.
So to help us unpack this, we are going to be using an episode of the American History Hit podcast.
Great podcast.
And this episode features historian Brian Newman.
Yeah, he's a good one.
So by the end of this, you'll not only understand, or at least have a better understanding of Pierce's presidency, but also how America was really grappling with this issue of slavery.
Yeah, front and center during his presidency, really just bubbling over.
Yeah. I mean, this is just a few years before the Civil War breaks out.
Absolutely. This is the lead up.
Yeah. So let's set the scene here. It's January of 1853.
Just weeks before Pierce is about to take office. He's on a train with his wife, Jane, and his 11-year-old son, Benny.
Right.
And they're heading back to New Hampshire after celebrating his election victory.
Okay.
Now, it's important to note that Jane
Yeah.
was not thrilled about her husband's political ambitions.
Right.
She was very religious
Yeah.
and kind of saw politics as a
distraction.
distraction from a higher calling.
Yeah, from God's purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
She believed in serving God above all else.
Yeah, so she's not exactly happy about this whole presidency thing.
No, not at all.
But there they are on the train,
Uh-huh.
celebrating, going back to New Hampshire.
Our new chapter about to begin.
New chapter. And then the unthinkable happens.
Yeah.
The train derails.
Horrible.
It's an awful scene.
Mhm.
Twisted metal, shattered glass.
A tragedy.
And in the midst of all this chaos,
Yeah.
their son, Benny, is killed.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
It's just an absolutely horrific event. And this is just weeks before he takes office.
Just weeks.
Now, how do you think,
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to talk about the decisions he makes as president. Obviously, we can't get inside his head, but
Yeah.
how much do you think this event colored his entire presidency?
Oh, I think enormously.
Yeah.
This is right before he's about to step into the most powerful position in the country. Imagine the weight of that grief,
Yeah.
the guilt. And, some historians even suggest that this event may have pushed him towards a very rigid, very legalistic view of the Constitution.
It's certainly something to consider.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop, this really, really awful
Yeah.
event. But before we get into his presidency, let's actually talk about Pierce the man, before all of this.
Okay.
He wasn't just some random guy who came out of nowhere to become president.
No, he had a pretty impressive resume.
Yeah, he was a state legislator. He served in the House of Representatives. He was a senator.
War hero, too.
Oh, yeah, brigadier general in the Mexican-American War.
Yeah, the guy had experience.
So he had the credentials. But he wasn't exactly, like the most charismatic guy in the room.
No, not a firebrand, that's for sure.
You know what's really interesting, though? It took 49 ballots at the Democratic Convention for him to secure the nomination.
49. Think about that.
Talk about a dark horse candidate.
It's incredible. I mean, what does that tell you about the state of the Democratic Party at the time?
Yeah, I mean, that says a lot about the political landscape back then.
It really does. It was a time of intense division, especially over the issue of slavery.
Right, the 1850s. I mean, talk about a powder keg. And the Compromise of 1850, which had attempted to settle these disputes, was really just, it was more of a Band-Aid than a real solution.
Yeah, it just papered over the cracks. The fundamental issues were still there, simmering beneath the surface.
So Pierce is stepping into the presidency at this really, really tense moment.
Yeah, picture it.
Yeah.
The North is increasingly against slavery. The abolitionist movement is gaining momentum. Meanwhile, the South is clinging to its way of life, feeling threatened, feeling like their voices aren't being heard.
And they see slavery as essential to their economy and way of life.
Exactly. And both sides are looking at each other with suspicion and fear. The potential for conflict, for violence, is palpable.
Into this volatile mix walks Franklin Pierce.
Still reeling from that personal tragedy.
Absolutely.
Determined to uphold the Constitution as he understands it and preserve the Union.
Determined to keep the country together.
At all costs. But as we'll see, his efforts to appease both sides will only end up making things worse.
Yeah, his presidency becomes this really stark example of how good intentions, or at least what he saw as good intentions,
Right.
can lead to disastrous outcomes when you're dealing with such a divisive issue like slavery.
Absolutely. It's a lesson that resonates throughout history and even today.
And speaking of disastrous outcomes, we have to address the elephant in the room, the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Oh boy, here we go.
This is the piece of legislation that really defines his presidency, and it has these lasting repercussions for the nation.
Absolutely. It set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the Civil War.
Now, before we get into that, can you just remind us about the Missouri Compromise and how it tried to address westward expansion and slavery?
Sure. So back in 1820, they came up with the Missouri Compromise. It was all about maintaining a balance of power, keeping the peace between free states and slave states.
Right.
So they drew this line across the Louisiana Purchase. Everything north of the line, except for Missouri itself, was supposed to be free territory.
Okay, so this was about maintaining a kind of delicate balance.
Exactly. But as the nation expanded westward,
Right.
the Missouri Compromise started to really crumble.
Yeah, more land, more territories, more problems.
More problems, exactly. And then after the Mexican-American War, America gained all this new territory.
Right.
California, Utah, New Mexico. And suddenly, the debate over slavery's expansion exploded again.
So the Missouri Compromise is starting to fall apart.
Yeah, it's not holding up.
And this is where Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, enters the scene with his vision for a transcontinental railroad.
Oh yeah, Douglas. Ambitious guy. Big plans.
He wanted to connect the East Coast to the Pacific. I mean, talk about a game changer.
It would have been huge. And Douglas, he was a big believer in something called popular sovereignty.
Popular sovereignty.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Basically, the idea was to let the people in each territory decide whether or not to allow slavery.
So a vote. Sounds pretty democratic.
On the surface, yes. But critics saw right through it.
What do you mean?
They saw it as a way to potentially open the door for slavery to spread,
Oh.
especially into these new territories. And as we'll see, those concerns were absolutely valid, especially in Kansas.
Okay, so we've got the stage set for this showdown.
Yeah, the tension is building.
We've got a nation on edge. The Missouri Compromise is breaking down. And this ambitious senator is pushing for westward expansion and popular sovereignty.
And at the center of it all is Franklin Pierce.
A president grappling with grief, determined to uphold the Constitution, and about to make decisions that will have profound consequences for the nation.
Buckle up.
Yeah, it's about to get real.
So we're back, diving deeper into the presidency of Franklin Pierce.
And last time, we were talking about the Gadsden Purchase.
Yeah, that little strip of land that completed the U.S. map.
Seems small compared to all the drama with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but you said it connects to those bigger themes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. Manifest destiny, the fight over where slavery could go, America's role in the world. It's all right there in that land deal.
Remind us what exactly it was and why it mattered so much.
Okay, so it's 1853. Pierce is president. His administration, they're working on this deal with Mexico
Yeah.
to buy a chunk of what's now Arizona and New Mexico. Why? Railroads?
Ah, that Southern Transcontinental Railroad he wanted.
Exactly. They needed that land to make it work. And bam! With the Gadsden Purchase, the U.S. had its coast-to-coast contiguous territory.
So, something we take for granted today, our map, that's partly thanks to Pierce.
In a way, yeah. But, of course, nothing simple with this guy.
What do you mean?
Well, Northerners, they saw this as just another way to help the South get more powerful.
Because of the railroad going through those states.
Right. So even while he's trying to calm things down over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Pierce is making moves that make things even more tense.
Man, this guy couldn't catch a break.
That's one way to put it. And it's not like domestic stuff was his only focus. Pierce had big ideas about America's place in the world.
Right, we can't forget about that treaty with Japan,
The Treaty of Kanagawa.
signed right during his presidency.
A big moment. Commodore Matthew Perry had done the hard work negotiating it, but under Pierce, it's signed. Japan, after centuries of being closed off, opens up for trade with the U.S.
It's hard to grasp how big a deal that was back then.
Imagine two completely different worlds suddenly connecting. Huge impact for both sides.
So Pierce has got this vision of America as a global power involved in trade, making its mark everywhere.
Definitely. But of course, not everyone loved that approach.
What were people saying?
Some thought it was too aggressive, too pushy, like who are we to force Japan out of its isolation? What about exploiting them?
So, kind of like with his domestic policies, Pierce's foreign policy is this mix of good intentions, maybe, but also actions that have consequences.
Long-lasting ones, too. Some we probably don't even fully grasp today.
Makes you think.
It does. And speaking of unintended consequences, let's circle back to that whole popular sovereignty idea.
Oh, yeah. Meant to be democratic, but led to all that violence in Kansas.
It's a head-scratcher, right? Like, how did something that sounds fair on paper go so wrong?
What went wrong?
Well, one big thing is it assumed everyone's playing by the rules, everyone gets an equal say, elections are honest.
Which wasn't the case in Kansas at all.
Not even close. We talked about those Missourians crossing the border, stuffing ballot boxes.
Voter fraud, basically.
Exactly. Popular sovereignty, it needs a level playing field to work. But in Kansas, those pro-slavery groups, they were playing dirty from the start.
Intimidation, violence.
It got really bad. Bleeding Kansas, that's what they called it. Raids, murders, battles, you name it.
And wasn't it when John Brown showed up?
Yeah, John Brown, abolitionist, believed in using any means necessary to end slavery.
Including violence.
Sadly, yes. What he did in Kansas, some people saw it as heroic, but it definitely made things even worse.
It's crazy to think this principle meant to give people a voice led to such darkness.
Shows you how fragile democracy can be. And when you've got extremism on top of that,
Yeah.
popular sovereignty in Kansas, it was like holding a match to a powder keg. It blew apart any idea that compromise could work when the core values were so different.
And Pierce's response didn't help.
Nope. Recognizing that pro-slavery government in Kansas, even though it was obviously rigged.
Made him look like he was siding with the South.
Exactly. To Northerners, it was like he cared more about keeping the Union together than about the fact that slavery was wrong. That's the thing that really sticks with Pierce. This inability to see the bigger picture, to bridge that gap between North and South, it's what defines his presidency.
So we've got this mess in Kansas, John Brown stirring things up, Pierce caught in the middle.
And to top it off, there's this whole other episode that gets forgotten sometimes.
What's that?
Pierce's attempt to buy Cuba.
Cuba. Why?
Remember, he's got this expansionist mindset, sees Cuba as valuable, something that'll make America stronger in the Caribbean.
I guess it makes sense strategically.
Yeah, and he was ready to spend big bucks to get it. Offered Spain a ton of money, but they weren't selling.
What did he do?
Well, some folks in his administration started talking about taking it by force.
Whoa.
Yeah, pretty wild. Their thinking was Cuba's economy was based on slavery, so they'd be natural allies with the South.
Maintaining that balance of power in Congress.
Right. Plus, they were worried about Europe getting involved in Cuba.
Spain was weak back then, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Fears that Britain or France might swoop in and grab it.
So for Pierce, taking Cuba was about keeping those European powers out of our backyard.
And there was this whole filibustering thing going on, too.
Filibustering?
Yeah, basically these private American armies going down to Latin America to overthrow governments.
Sounds messy.
Oh, it was. Pierce's administration, they were worried these guys would cause a war with Spain.
So Cuba was a headache waiting to happen.
Yeah. Pierce's push to get it, it was about expansion strategy, but also about trying to control this already explosive situation.
A lot on his plate.
And it backfired, of course. Northerners, they were furious about the idea of buying Cuba.
That slave power conspiracy again?
Exactly. Just reinforced the idea that he was in the South's pocket.
Like every move he made, even with good intentions, just made the divide worse.
And that's what ultimately did him in. By the end of his term, nobody liked him. Couldn't even get his party to nominate him again.
What a way to go out.
He left office watching the nation he tried so hard to save crumbling around him. Pretty tragic end to a presidency full of good intentions, tough choices, and, well, events that led straight to the Civil War.
It's a lot to take in. We've covered popular sovereignty gone wrong, violence, John Brown, Pierce trying to keep the country from falling apart, and now this whole Cuba situation.
And through it all, Pierce, clinging to the Constitution, to the idea of the Union, but his actions, they just fueled the fire.
His legacy is definitely complicated.
Absolutely. He's a reminder that good intentions aren't enough, and sometimes the choices you make, even for what you think are the right reasons, can have devastating results.
There's a lot to unpack there. But before we wrap up, I think we need to talk about what we can learn from Pierce, from his successes and failures.
Yeah, what does his story tell us about leadership, about compromise, about democracy itself? That's what we'll get into next time.
So we've set this whole deep dive exploring Franklin Pierce, a president who often gets lost in the shuffle, right?
Yeah, overshadowed by the Civil War, definitely not the most memorable name.
We've looked at the personal tragedies that shaped him, those tough political choices he made.
Decisions that, in the end, helped bring about the very conflict he was trying to avoid.
It's kind of ironic when you think about it.
Definitely. We dug into the Kansas-Nebraska Act, saw how that whole popular sovereignty thing backfired.
All that violence and bleeding Kansas, his ambitions with Cuba, all that stuff.
Yeah, it's been a journey.
It has, but now I think we need to talk about his legacy, how historians view him today.
Okay, so if you're looking at those presidential rankings, Pierce, he's not usually up there with the greats.
Not a surprise, I guess.
No, he's often near the bottom.
Yeah.
That whole Civil War looming over him, and he's just not as captivating as some of the other guys from that era.
I can see why. Supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act the way he dealt with bleeding Kansas.
And his stance on slavery itself, defending it as a constitutional right, even with all the violence it caused.
Yeah, that's tough to defend.
It is. But here's the thing. We got to try to see it from his perspective in the context of his time.
All right, things were different back then.
Very different. Back then, slavery was woven into the fabric of American life. Even many Northerners saw it as, well, just the way things were.
So maybe we're judging him too harshly through our modern lens.
Maybe. Pierce was working within a totally different political landscape. He genuinely thought he was doing right by the country.
He was trying to uphold the Constitution as he understood it.
Exactly. He believed preserving the Union was the most important thing, even if it meant compromising on the issue of slavery.
And we see those compromises as, well, morally wrong.
Absolutely. But for him, keeping the country together was paramount. That unwavering commitment to the Union, even if it meant overlooking a moral wrong, that's at the heart of his presidency.
It's tough to reconcile those two things, that dedication to unity with, well, allowing something as awful as slavery to continue.
It is, but we can't just dismiss him as a bad president. His story is more complicated than that.
And he did have some accomplishments, like opening up trade with Japan.
The Treaty of Kanagawa, a major diplomatic win.
And the Gadsden Purchase, even if it was controversial.
It did help shape the U.S. as we know it.
So Pierce's legacy isn't just about failure. There's more to it.
It's nuanced. He was a guy full of contradictions, stuck in a time of huge change, making choices that had big consequences, both good and bad.
What do you think we can learn from all this? What's relevant today?
Well, for one, it shows how important it is to balance principles with being practical.
Okay.
Pierce, he had strong principles, believed in the Constitution, the Union, but being unwilling to compromise on slavery, to find a way to end that injustice, it undermined everything he stood for.
So even the strongest beliefs need to adapt to reality.
Sometimes, yeah, you got to be flexible, willing to compromise to achieve something better.
Makes sense.
And another thing, Pierce's story shows how dangerous it is to ignore what's morally right just to get ahead politically.
Sweeping those tough issues under the rug.
Exactly. By putting unity above dealing with slavery, he just delayed the inevitable. It shows how important it is for leaders to have moral courage.
To do what's right, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And lastly, I think Pierce reminds us to consider the context of history.
Not judging the past by today's standards.
Right. We can criticize his choices, but to really understand him, we got to step back and see the world through his eyes. What did people believe back then? What were the political pressures he faced?
It's about empathy. Trying to understand the past, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's about realizing that even people with good intentions, acting within their time, can make decisions that have terrible consequences.
So Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, a war hero, devoted family man, a guy who believed deeply in the Constitution.
And ultimately, a leader whose choices helped lead to one of the darkest periods in American history.
It's a complicated story full of lessons about leadership, morality, and how fragile democracy really is.
It makes you think, doesn't it? About the choices we face today, the values we hold dear, the kind of future we want to build.
Definitely something to reflect on. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the presidency of Franklin Pierce. We hope you'll keep exploring this era, digging into the sources, and coming to your own conclusions about this complex and controversial figure.
And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those deep dives going.
See you then.